Before we start this video, a large thank you to Ice-T96, Brian, Milan, Kyle, Studios Anateo, Forgotten Dev 96, Jack Hughes, Corey, S, Jared, Addison, and Rex for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Hello everybody. So we're going to make it so we can buff our weapons now, and we're actually going to add an effect to them, and we're going to basically change their damage. So this is going to be a consumable item. So let's jump right in here now and go to the scripts folder. I'm just going to reorganize this quickly, and now I'm going to go to the new folder I've made called Quick Slot Items, and I'm going to make a new script called Weapon Buff Consumable Item. So guys, I want to start off by saying there's going to be some really big changes in the next few videos, but they're going to be definitely for the better. I mean, it's always for the better, but this is going to make things a lot more modular in terms of how we deal effects to our characters, because now we have this new character effect system, so we're going to be utilizing it over the next few episodes. But I digress. Back to the topic at hand. Let's make a new folder in the scripts called effects. I'm going to drag my newly made character effect and the modified damage type static effect in here. And we're going to make a new effect, and it's going to be called buff weapon effect. Now, this technically isn't an effect that affects our character, but it is something our character needs to do. And the reason we're doing this, like so, is so we can make basically different types of weapon buffs using this same script. It just makes it a lot more modular, and I'll expand on that in a moment. So let's make a namespace SG in our weapon buff consumable item and our weapon buff effect scripts. So the consumable item is going to act as an item class, and it's going to hold a weapon buff effect variable. And you can tweak both of these to your liking. We're going to make the weapon buff effect derive from character effect, because that's how we process all of our character effects. But basically, you can reuse these same two scripts and make a bunch of different kind of effects. So you can tweak effects that modify your physical damage, your fire damage, your magic damage, your lightning damage, whatever you want to do. So let's start off by making a weapon buff effect variable on the weapon buff consumable item. I'm going to make a header for this effect. I know before I used to use public all the time because this was a tutorial and I didn't care, but I realized that that's embedding some bad habits into people. So if you've noticed in the last few videos, I've been using serialized field where it's necessary, and I've been making variables serializable instead of public when I want to see in the inspector. I'm going to refrain from doing things that would be otherwise, I guess, not good habits, even in tutorial videos like this. I know this isn't an actual project, but I'm going to treat it like one. Now let's make a header for buff sound effects. So let's make a serializable field again for the audio clip, and this is just going to be the audio cue that plays when you activate the buff consumable item. So this is just maybe it could be the sound of your sword catching on fire, or you applying some kind of lightning to it, whatever it may be. And now back here in the weapon buff effect, let's make our variables. Let's make a header first for buff info, and then let's make a serializable field. And let's go and minimize this, and let's actually go into the game and go to our enums, because we need to add an enum for this for our first field. And I'm going to name this enum buff class. And the buff class will be, is it physical, fire, magic, lightning, darkness, whatever you want to call it. Basically every type of buff in the game that you have, you want to make a class for it, because based on this class, we're going to choose the effects we apply. So is it a fire effect we're going to add to the weapon? Is it a lightning effect, etc., etc.? So back into the weapon buff effect, let's make a serializable field for buff class and call that buff class. Now, right below that, let's make another serializable field, and let's call this float for length of buff. And let's make a public float for time remaining on buff. And now guys, we're just going to do all the setup in this video. We're going to make all the variables and all the classes, and we're going to lay it all out. So in the next video, we can just nail it all together. But I'll be explaining what each thing does as we type it. Let's make a hide inspector public bool for is right-handed buff. The reason why we're hiding in the inspector is because we don't need to see it, but it does need to be public because it needs to be accessed from another class. So below that, again, let's make a header for buff effects, specifically actually sound effects, so we can say SFX. Going to make a serializable field here. Going to call or make a variable of type audio clip, and I'm going to call this buff ambient sound. And then if you want, let's make a float here, serializable field again for the ambient sounds volume. So the ambient sound will just be the sound the weapon is going to make when you're just holding it. So it could be ambient fire background noise at a very low volume, or lightning, or just magic sounds. Just when the weapon is already buffed, this will be the ambient sound that plays. You notice I'm going all in with this one. I'm going to really add everything I have in my other project, Nephilim. I'm going to do the polish included in just a couple of videos. So this is going to be a fully, really fleshed out system when it's done. So let's make another header for damage info. Let's make a serializable float for base damage multiplier. So the way this works is basically depending on what you're doing to the weapon, it's going to multiply your base damage and in the future your scaling damage, or just the base damage if you want, by this value. This is a percentage value, so 15 will be 15%, meaning this buff will take all of your weapon's damage and then it will take 15% of the total and basically add it on to the buffed damage. Now let's make a header here in case you want poise buff damage as well. So if you want your buff to also increase poise damage, we can make a serializable float, do the same thing. We can say buff poise damage multiplier. And I'm going to put that at base 15 or base 0 if you don't want it at all. It's up to you. Let's make a bool 2 here actually for buff poise damage, so we know if we want to buffer poise damage or not. And I'm just going to copy and paste the multiplier and change the word damage to poise. And you know what? Just to be super clear, I'm actually going to put percentage in the name of these two variables, just so I can get rid of this comment. It's very clear what the variable is then. So it's going to say buff base damage percentage modifier or multiplier. And that sounds very clear. Obviously, you know then that it buffs the damage by a percentage. And then we can get rid of that comment, or you can keep it if you'd like. All right, moving along. Let's go below the poise buff header. Let's make a new header again. Lots of headers today. We're going to call this just general. This is just the information that I really don't know what else to put into. I guess you can put under buff info if you want, but I'm going to put it down here. Serializable field, bool, buff has started is equal to false. I'm just now realizing that I could totally put that under buff info, but you know what? I'm committing. General's fine. All right, so let's save that and let's minimize this script. Now let's go over to our project. Let's go into the scripts folder, then the items folder, and I'm going to make a new script here, another one. Call this weapon manager. Now, this is not a script that goes on our player. This is a script that goes on our weapon, because we're going to need to control what happens in our weapon with these buff scripts. So let's make a private weapon manager variable in here under the weapon buff effect. So basically every weapon in the game from now on will get one of these scripts, these weapon manager scripts, and we can do a lot of cool stuff with this. So let's make a namespace up here. Now let's open up the curly bracers, brackets. I don't know what to call those things. And let's actually save this. And then we're just going to start by making our variables on here too. And you know, we're even going to fill out some functionality inside the weapon manager. So let's make a header for buff effects. This time it's actual effects, not just sound effects. Serializable field game object for the physical buff effects, and then I'm going to use one for the fire buff effects. And as I said before in the video, you want to add magic, lightning, darkness, go ahead. I'm just going to use 2 examples because it's identical throughout. As always, I will just continue to use these 2 examples. So let's make a header for trail effects, and yes, this is different. This is what the trail that's following the weapon is going to look like depending on what buff your weapon currently has. So I'm going to make a particle system for the default trail. This will specifically usually be on the physical buffs or the no buff at all. Sometimes physical buffs have their own different trail too. And then next, we're going to use the fire trail effects. Now I recognize that Dark Souls 3 doesn't really have any physical buff consumable items, at least not that I know of, but I just made this as a variable in case you guys wanted to add one. Maybe you can cover your weapon in rocks or something. So next, a private bool weapon is buffed and a private buff class for weapon buff class. So we're going to use the weapon buff class to determine what trail we use and what effects we turn on when the weapon is newly buffed. Next, let's add a hide inspector public damage collider. So this is just the damage collider of the weapon. Call that damage collider. This is how we're going to alter the damage values when the weapon is buffed. And then we're going to do a public audio source. Let's call it audio source. This is for the ambience of the weapon. And now we can start filling in some of these variables on awake. We could say damage collider is equal to get component in children because we're going to put this on the main game object of the weapon. And then we can say that the audio source, we can actually just use get object.add component. And that will save you from having to add an audio source to every single weapon that you already have in the game. If you have a lot, that'll save you a little bit of time. So then we could say public void buff weapon. And we're going to need to pass our buff class. And then we're going to need some values for our damage, of course, naturally. So before we buff our weapon, we're going to need to make sure that it's not already buffed. So let's add a few more functions here. We want to add one for debuff weapon, because we don't want to add a buff on top of another buff and generate infinite amounts of damage. And we're going to make a public void for, whoops, not that, play weapon trail effects. And this will replace the way we play weapon trails currently. So under buff weapon, the first thing you want to do is call debuff weapon. Because when you buff a weapon, you want to erase any already active buff. And let's actually add a variable here for float physical buff damage. And then float fire buff damage. So yeah, first thing you want to do is to clear out any active buff already. Unless you don't want that, in which case you can not put this here. But I'm going to make a comment to say reset any active buff, debuff weapon. Okay, so what else do we need to do? Well, we want to add damage to this weapon, but as you're going to see shortly, this is going to give us a problem. And why is that? Well, let's see. If we type weapon is buffed is equal to false here in debuff weapon, so that's the first step of debuffing weapon. We want to stop the audio, this being the ambient audio. So we're going to say audio source.stop. That stops any like fire effects sounds from playing. We can turn off all of our active buff effects, so physical buff effects set active as false, fire buff effects set active as false. And then we want to take away any buff damage. But you can see here we can't edit the physical damage because that starts getting a bit weird. We can't edit the regular damage values of the weapon. So what we need to do is we need another set of damage variables called buff damage variables. And these are variables that will always change and will always reset to 0 when there's no buff active. So we need to make another damage collider called melee weapon damage collider. And this is going to inherit all of the basic information from our damage collider, but it's going to have its own set of information as well. So we can call this melee damage collider, or melee weapon damage collider rather. So that's the great thing about inheriting from base classes is you get to use all the old functionality, but then you can add new stuff on top of it. So what we're going to do is put our namespace down, make this derive from the damage collider script, and then we're going to add a new set of variables specifically for the physical buff damage, the fire buff damage, and the poise buff damage. And we're going to take one of these functions in here and we're going to override it. Which one? Well, obviously it would need to be the deal damage function. So let's go back over into our melee weapon damage collider scripts and let's add a header for buff damage or weapon buff damage. And let's make our float values or integer values, whatever you want to do, I suppose, for physical and fire. And if you have it, lightning and darkness and magic or whatever kinds of damage you have, ice, whatever name you've given to it, add them all here. Now on the deal damage, back on the damage collider script, what we want to do is actually basically take everything inside this function, because we can use our handy override, which means it will just not use the deal damage on this script, but it will use the deal damage on our script or this newer script. So copy and paste, or copy rather, everything within the deal damage functionality. And then over here on the melee weapon damage collider, let's say override deal damage. Let's erase the base because we don't want to use the base logic. We want our own logic here specifically. And now we're going to change a few things. Okay, so first off, we want to do this so we can actually add on our new damages to the current damage of the weapon, that being our buff damage. So the difference between a regular damage collider and a melee damage collider is that the melee damage collider can be buffed. So we're going to simply say final physical damage equals physical damage plus physical buff damage. And we can make a float for the final fire damage equals fire damage plus fire buff damage. So you can see now it just adds a new value onto the already existing damage values. Now before I didn't actually pass the fire damage because I was showing this as an example and I did only the physical for some reason. So I'll add that right now to this video. We can make a public float for poise buff damage as well. We can add that on. And let's just basically modify this code so it now supports the fire damage as well, or rather I'm going to. You probably already have that done. And I'm going to make a float here called final damage. Now, we don't need final damage currently, but in the future it will be useful. And why is this? Well, as I type out my my fire damage, I'm just going to explain. Right now, we actually take damage from a function called take damage, but we have a new system, which is a character effects system. So don't mind the final damage variable right now. You don't even have to change anything. You can just keep it exactly the same, just adding your buff damage and don't change anything else. But in the future, we're going to make damage handled through a thing called a character effect because it is so much neater and so much cleaner and more modular. And what we're going to be able to do is we're going to give the take damage functionality its own full effect. So basically, if you have an attack that has a custom variable, like maybe let's say you want to play a custom damage animation for one specific attack, you can do that. If you want to modify certain poise values for certain attacks, you can do that. Basically, it just makes the whole process a lot neater, and it's very simple. We'll just have to basically generate a damage effect at the point of damage, which happens on a damage collider, and pass all the values. That's it. So for now, don't worry about the final damage variable. You don't need to do it. Just pass your damage as you normally would. I'm just adding fire damage to this now because, as I said, when I made this as an example, I didn't add it in. I only accounted for physical. And then down below, in your take damage, no animation, and take damage, just pass your physical, your fire, your magic, whatever damages you have. The point of making this melee weapon damage collider script right now is to be able to add weapon buff damages to our regular damages. Obviously, in the future, this will have even more logic added onto it. That is the nature of the beast. As the project gets more dense, you want to make things more modular so things stay more simple, more clean, more easy. So I'm just going to pass the final physical damage and the final fire damage. Going to say mathf round to int, and we are good to go. Now, as you know, the final physical damage and the final fire damage consists of the base weapon damage plus the buff damage. All right, so let's save that, and that's good to go. Now, back over on the weapon manager, where is that? Here it is. We want to simply say on debuff weapon, first we want to make sure we change damage collider to melee weapon damage collider, so we don't get an error on the awake. And I got 2 W's there. There we go. We want to come out here now and say physical buff damage is equal to 0. Damage collider.physical buff damage is equal to 0. Damage collider.fire buff damage is equal to 0. And damage collider.poise buff damage is equal to 0. So now you can safely modify and reset these values without messing with the base values of your weapon. All right, excellent. So let's go down here now on the play weapon trail effects. And we're going to start by checking with an if statement for if the weapon is buffed. If so, then we're going to use a switch statement to go through the buff class types. Mine is not autofilling for some reason. What is happening? Just one moment. Okay, here we go. So on the physical, I'm just going to say, in my case, you can say if default trail does not equal null, then you can play the effects. But if you want to keep it even neater, what I'm going to do, instead of saying if default trail effects does not equal null, just because I like the way it looks, I'm going to say if default trail effects equals null, I'm just going to simply say return. And if not, then we can go and proceed to the next line of code, which will be default trail effects.play. Okay, now down here for fire, I'm going to say if fire trail effects is equal to null, return. If it's not, continue. And we're going to say fire trail effects.play. That's it. So this will eventually overwrite how we play our weapon trail effects. Right now, I can't remember how we do it, but we're going to be using it from the weapon manager from now on. So in the next video, I'm going to override how it's handled currently. And then I'm just going to make a comment here. If our weapon is physically buffed, we play the default trail. If our weapon is fire buffed, we play the fire trail. All right, so let's go over to the buff weapon, and so let's finish that up. All right, so right under debuff weapon, I'm going to say weapon is buffed is equal to true. And I'm going to say weapon buff class is equal to buff class, not capital B. And then we're going to say audio source dot play. Whoops, it's always giving me capitals right now. There we go. So this plays the AMI volume of the buff. And then we're going to say right below that, I'm going to make a space here because this is a switch statement now. Depending on which type of buff from buff class, we're going to activate a certain set of effects, the game object rather, that the effects are housed under. So if we have a physical buff, oops, I'm going to copy and paste default breakdown here because I don't think I put it here under play weapon trail. There we go. So if we have a physical buff, then we're going to say right in here, we want to set active the game object that has our physical buff effects. So it will be physical buff effects.setActive is equal to true. That's it. And then in the case of the fire buff, want to do the same thing. Fire buff effects.setActive is equal to true. And there we go. All right, so that is a lot of the functionality kind of later here, but we're not done yet. Let's just go down here and call upon our damage collider. And then we're going to say damage collider.physical buff damage is equal to physical buff damage. Damage collider.fire buff damage is equal to fire buff damage. And damage collider.poise buff damage is equal to poise buff damage. We need to make it, so we have to pass that as well. So we actually have all the logic laid out here now, all the variables to actually start putting this all together, which we are going to do in the next video. So in the next video, we are going to make it so when we use a consumable item on a weapon that is buffable, we will ignite or cover that weapon in a buff effect. It will play a sound effect. It will have increased damage and possibly poise damage. And it will change the trail of that weapon to the trail that matches the new buff effects on that weapon. So if you guys made it this far, be sure to drop a like, leave a comment. It does genuinely help out the series so much. You have no idea. And as always, a special thank you to my patrons. Because of you guys, I can keep doing this. So I appreciate your support, of course. I'm really excited to continue this system. So I will see you guys in the next one, where we will hopefully conclude the weapon buffs. And then we can move on to some new character effects. All right, guys, take care. See you soon.